Uh,
Dr. Gore's Bedtime Stories, The Enterprise of Death by Jesse Bullington. Chapter 2. The Coming of His Acolytes. I like the sound of this already.
me too.
Something other than the wind howled in the darkness of the Sierra Nevadas. The Andalusian currents blowing rain straight into the mouth of the grotto as if the world had turned on its side and the African captives were in a pit instead of a cave. Despite the cold and wet, the beautiful harem girl Omro slept, and could scarce have awoken had she been of a mind to. Days spent in idle abandon had ill prepared her for forced marches over the cruelest terrain her bare feet had ever blessed with their perseverance. And bundled in the soggy clothing her servants had stripped off, she groaned and tossed on the stone floor of the cave. Halin crouched naked behind his mistress, staring at a point in the blackness at the rear of the cave. When lightning flared, the bandit chief was illuminated. His eyes likewise fixed ahead so that when the weather permitted, he could return the eunuch's glare. The man stationed at the entrance was only one more exposed to the storm than the three Africans, and he entertained no false hope of sleep in such conditions, and so amused himself by waiting for the lightning to give him more glimpses of the two naked Moors. Dirty bugger.
Oh,
The
can you not?
slave clung to Omrose's back, confident her mistress slept too heavily to awaken and discover her impertinence. Our had never before touched Omrose or any master without permission, and the sensation of Omrose's heart beating against her chest brought new and strange thoughts to the girl. On the hard march, Omrose had tried to hide her pain and fear, but her hazel eyes had bubbled over like the fountains in the harem's courtyard when Awa offered her lady her own share of water.
No.
Omrose had smiled as she took the drink, an honest if sad smile. Such kindness in spite of hardship confirmed for Awa that she had come into the company of an extraordinary creature indeed, a girl not unlike herself, but one previously gifted with a far grander existence. Awa recognized that her own chaotic life was again mutating, and that life had taught her that when armed men force you to accompany them on treks through the wild, and the end result is never for the better. She would have run and escaped too, for these men were clearly not slavers by trade. But she had resolved not to abandon Omrose even before the calamities of the recent days. Her mistress was only a few years her senior, and mayhap that made her seem more agreeable, unlike the rest of her former masters. Omrose never shouted or beat her. That she would come to prize and consider such a simple courtesy never occurred to the happy daughter of the fond headman. Our had once been, but experience is just that. Crouching beside the young woman, Halim had decided that the flashes of lightning were infrequent enough that he could throttle Omrose and her slave to death before being discovered. Whether he would or should, Halim was not certain. Even with Bobadil's orders that Omrose be granted a quick and royal death rather than fall into the hands of lowly men should piratery or banditry occur, when the lightning lit them up, the bandit chief saw that the eunuch had broken his blind stare and looked instead at the sleeping woman beside him. Then the cave went dark again, only the rioting storm giving indication of where the cavern's exit was located in the blackness. He would not, Hallam decided, not admitting that upon seeing Omro's beatific sleeping face, he could not. Omrose awoke to feel someone holding her down, but too terrified to scream. The wet cloth against her cheek and the quaking of the naked slave pressed against her back cheated the noble girl of any hope that she had been suffering a nightmare. She realized the girl was not pinning her down, but hugging her gently. And while a few days before the indignity of having the slave touch her might have sent Ambrose into hysterics, there in the freezing darkness, the warmth hour provided was palpable and calming. Confident neither the wretched creature on her back nor the men could see, Ambrose let her tears join the growing pools on the cavern floor. This is sad. Awa drew away as her mistress shook with barely contained sob, then gingerly returned her fingers to Ombro's shoulder. The wind ran down the gaps between the girls, a growing chill spreading from Omrose's back towards her feet and neck. Disgust again triumphed by need. Omrose snaked her own bound hands up through the layers of wet cloth and took Awa's shuddering fingers, wiggling herself backward to again press against her slave. Awa found herself smiling in the dark as she squeezed Omrose's fingers, and her mistress squeezed back. And after enjoying the clammy feel of the girl's silk soft palms, she pushed her fingers down and set to work at the leather straps tying Omrose's wrists together. She would rescue her lady just as Hallam had rescued them from the sinking boat. We'll get loose and then we'll run, Ara whispered in the seashell that was Omrose's ear. The rain will hide our footprints if we get out of the cave. What? The thought of escape had not crossed Omrose's mind after Hallam was beaten into submission upon initially resisting the bandits. They have a guard, but only one, I think. The rest are behind us, out of the rain. The clumsy knots at Omrose's wrist confirmed for Awa the bandits' inexperience in the ways of transporting slaves. But if there's a guard, shh, said Awa. I untie you, you untie me, I untie Hallam. Who? The eunuch who saved us. Oh. I untie him, then we three run. Awa lowered her voice even more. He's biggest, so they'll likely grab him before you and me. And he'll fight for you if you're the one they catch. Are you sure? I've done this before, said Awa, trying to keep a nervous fear in its own cave as she got the last knot loose. Once we're free, we have to avoid being caught again. But let's worry about that rain when next we dry, all right? All right. Now we must be very quiet so they think we're sleeping, said Awa. Don't pull on my knots. Find the root of the twist and work it backward. Her skin free of the biting leather, Omrose enjoyed the sensation for a time before choosing to acknowledge the slave's still bound hands pressing urgently into her shoulder. Omrose remembered what her old handmaiden had said about Awa's scars, meaning she had run and been captured several times. I remembered how they laughed at the idea of the plump wretch running anywhere on her short legs. So set to freeing Awa's wrist, pausing as her slave had done when she heard the faint scraping and squelching of their captors moving about in the dark. And although it took her much longer, she eventually got them loose. The storm died down, only to periodically flare up like the white coals of a long burning fire. Dozing in his cramped squat, Hallam felt a creature crawl across his foot and almost stomped it when fingers tightened around his ankle and tapped just above where the strap dug into his skin. The length between his feet having been shortened to a hand's width after they stopped moving for the day. Hallam let her work at his ankles, praying that the lightning kept at bay a little longer. It did, and he lowered his wrist where she made short work of. Flexing his fingers, he winced as the joints crackled loudly in the dark. Ow. Feeling around, Hallam soon found a jagged piece of stone and tightened his fist, intent on giving his life, if it meant the escape of Omrose. Then the cave lit up as the lightning returned, and the three sets of eyes widened. The back of the cave was empty.
Oh.
Mm. As the thunder pealed across the peaks, Our slowly rose to a crouch and helped his mistress up. The slave's numbed, slick skin started to remind its owner of its presence as pain and cold began jumping all over her body. Another flash, much closer, and again they saw only the black and empty cavern. The dozen bandits vanished without a trace. The thunder came again, and Al wondered if the mountain had eaten the men who'd hid in its mouth, and now laughed along with his ally in the sky, who had driven the prey to seek such shelter. They had to leave before swallowed again. Now we run, Our said, finding Ombro's hand in the dark. You must follow me, mistress, no matter what. When we run, we cannot stop. Where are they? Omrose tried to stand, but her overworked legs fought against her, cramps forcing her to lean against the wall of the cave. What if it's a trap? Then it's not a good trap since we're already caught. Please, mistress, before we find out what's happened to them. But Omrose bit her lip in the dark. I can't run. I can't. You can, Our squeezed her mistress's quivering hand. You can, Omrose. The cheek of Our using her name momentarily made Omrose forget her fear of the dark, empty cave. Don't you? Quiet now. Had seen something more than an empty cave, and he scuttled away from the whispering girls. Passing around in the dark, he asked for a light from above, and was granted his request as three bolts crashed down just outside the cave. The wind screaming, and the rain biting as he scooped up two discarded swords, the hilt of one sticky and wet. Then he noticed that the puddle in which he stood felt comfortably warm on his bare, blistered feet, and over the thunder rattling his senses, he heard Omrose's scream.
Mm.
It's truly terrifying. The attacker smashed into Halim, and he felt both swords fly away as fists pummeled his sides. He slid down the wall of the cave, the assailant's bony fingers cutting into the eunuch's ribs with each blow. Ombrose's scream broke off, and Halim lost his breath as a cudgel bruised his stomach. And then the man pinned his arms behind his back and hoisted him up, the eunuch's back scraping on the man's rough armor as he was carried out into the storm. Lightning blasted the earth just above the cave, and Halim saw that their new captors, and his own screams drowned out both Omrose and the crackling thunder. Our our had smelled them even before the first flash of lightning had made Omrose scream, and now that the sky afire showed her their faces, she understood why her mother had never answered a question about how she would know if the spirits visiting her were those of the dead and not some more common natural thing, like the water spirits that misted her face by the waterfall, or the storm spirits that filled her nose with their hot odor before the rains. Now she knew, for these spirits rode their old bones, and some still wore their carrion flesh in the same loose fashion her mistress wore the dangling wet rags of her servants.
And not just ordinary spirits, boring ones.
Yeah. The bonemen hoisted them up before they could move, as they were held aloft by the strongest arms Our had ever felt. Lightning illuminated the skull, appraising her, and she screamed for the first time since she had been taken from a village by the slavers, when she had vowed that no matter what fear she felt, she would not give any spirit or man this power over her. Yet as the sky revealed the undead things carrying her, and the first person she cared about since childhood, up the mountain into death, she screamed and screamed. The spirits passing their three victims amongst them, as though the youth weighed nothing no more than satchels of limes. Halim lost himself in terror, gibbering along with the clicking jawbones of the monstrosities carrying them high into the mountains. But Omrose had recovered enough to realize what had happened and why the bandits had disappeared from the cave. Their captors had murdered the three of them in the cavern, and now she was on her way to hell. The lightning flashes Allah seeking in vain for her soul amidst the vast nightscape of the damned. She cursed him then, cursed him as weak and unfair to those who praised him, even if they could not understand him in the way he explained to mortals such as she. And as she was juggled from skeletal fingers to rotting soft arms, she vomited into the swirling rain, the stink of her sick and fear mingling with the fell stench of the demons.
Mm.
A tiny light appeared high above them in the darkness. The lightning left far below as they climbed higher and higher, the skeletal members of the host casting themselves against cliff faces, their bones scattering up the sheer surface to become animate ladders for their riper compatriots to scale with their prisoners held high. Several times they came to vast chasms, and the skeletons climbed atop one another and formed bridges over the gulfs. The farthest flung amongst them, snatching the ankles of the one before him, and in this fashion retracting themselves to the opposite side once the sharp spines had been crossed by the fleet-footed capering dead. Racing up a gully, they emerged onto a plateau, and here they were blinded by the light shining from an open door in the darkness, a glowing passage to another world. And before any of the three youths could recover from their journey, they were shoved wailing through the doorway.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
Wow, that's. You've almost got to feel sorry for them.
Yeah, for
Can't
sure.
work out who it is that's attacked and captured them. I'm trying to.
Well, all we know so far is it's a load of undead.
Mm.
Skeletons and zombies.
Spirits of the ancients. Terrifying.
Shall we carry on?
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 3. The Crucible of Madness. The animated corpses stayed outside. Omrose, Hallam, and Auer collapsed in a pile on the floor of the hut. A small oil lamp sealed their eyes into leaking slits with its brilliance, and as a shadow passed over the huddled youths, Hallam squealed and Omrose groaned. Then the door was closed behind them, and with the devil shut outside, all three wept with relief and gratitude. Not bloody surprised. None of them ever fully recovered from that night, their minds hammered into strange new shapes by white-hot fear. But after no small time of babbling and begging and praying and moaning, the three Africans returned to their senses. Being so close to heaven, dawn came early on the mountain top, and as the only window slowly ate up the shadows in the hut, first Auer, then Omrose, and finally Hallam sat up and took notice of their surroundings and their saviour, who had sat watching them this entire time. That's creepy. The
Mhm.
room was cluttered but clean, the stone floor rubbed smooth, and the adobe walls free of cracks. A granite table dominated the chamber, a crude wooden chair pulled back on the other side of it, and set in the rear of the wall above this was the window, through which one of the animated skeletons watched them. Noticing this brought on another fit in Hallam, but Omrose and Auer were already paralyzed by the sight of a monster hulking on its hind legs beside the window, a furry behemoth that Bobadil's second cousin would have recognized all too well. Eventually, they realized it must be dead or a statue, although our suspected that, given the walking corpses outside, the bear's seemingly inanimate nature in no way rendered it harmless. Every wall was striped with shelves that bowed under the weight of clay jars and bowls and less identifiable objects, and a cauldron hung inside a small fireplace to their right. Sounds like a goth house. Their host was less mundane. He was human enough, but his cold jade eyes were set deep in the tight skin of his face, and he appeared far too aged to even sit up in a bed and chew solid food. Yet he now darted around the room with an easy alacrity. His uh, his withered limbs piling the table with bowls and a jug. Then he opened the door, and Hallam buried his head between his legs. Omrose grabbed Auer's hand as the three of the skeletons marched into the room and squatted down beside the table. With a muttered word from their host, the skeletons fell apart on the floor, only to have their loose bones crawl over one another and snap together in new formations.
Ooh.
And in less time than is taken to cleanse oneself before prayer, 3 stools were waiting at the table. This bothered the young woman quite a bit. Our conceived that he was a sorcerer, and Omrose that he was the devil. Please sit and eat, the man said, his Arabic crisp despite his pale skin. Now! Even Hallam acquiesced, none of them eager to see what might happen should they disobey. They all balked at the stools, but the ribs seats scooped their bottoms comfortably and were not as sharp as they appeared. How do you scoop a bottom?
I would show you. I only have a camera.
Gripping skills.
Oh, if only I had. Hallam and Omrose stared doubtfully at the grey chunks floating in the stew that he ladled out, but Auer's mouth flooded at the all-familiar goat spirits rushed into her nose, rubbed their musky backs on her tongue,
Ooh.
and she forgot her fear.
Oh.
That sounds a lot grosser than what it actually is.
Seeing Auer slurp up the food, Omrose set her dignity aside to sate her hunger, but Hallam only drank water from the jug out of his smaller bowl. His knotted, burning stomach advised against attempting anything solid, and only with great effort was he able to keep himself from checking the window to see if the skeletons still watched him. He wondered if it was all punishment for not following his master's order to throttle Omrose rather than risk her defilement, and he cursed his own cowardice. Yes, because that's the problem.
The stools you're sitting on are freaking made of human remains.
And it's all because he didn't kill the girl.
Mm-hmm.
Now then, the man said, reclining in the chair across the table from them. Welcome, welcome. My apologies for any discomfort experienced, but I assure you the mercies of those men who had you bound would have proven no gentler. As a matter of fact, I don't think it would be any exaggeration at all to say that you children owe me your lives.
Oh.
Omrose didn't say anything. Auer did not say anything. Hallam swallowed and picked up his bowl of stew. I am, as you see, a simple hermit. The man leaned forward and leered at them, exposing a set of uneven yellow teeth. A lonely goat herd. I lack enough stock to feed every beggar who crosses my border, and so you will have to earn your keep by doing as I say. I live a sparse life, as you see, and have little room under my roof. I therefore suggest you work together to build a shelter before the next storm. Winter comes quickly up here, and you don't want to get caught without something substantial when the snow falls. Unaware if her companion's silence meant lack of manners or a surfeit of terror, Ombro shakily stood and managed a quavering, "Thank you." "It's nothing, nothing." The man waved his hand dismissively. "I always need more hands, more backs." "No," Ombros closed her eyes, swallowed, and then opened them again. "Thank you, but no, we have to go now. We have pressing business." The man widened his grin. "Loving parents?" "No, no, I don't think so. You're mine now, just like my other little helpers. You will help me, won't you? You'll do what I ask without my having to order."
Mm.
I Omrose could not stop shaking, even when Hour's fingers found her hand. "I run!" Hallam
Yeah.
hurled his shoe in the man's face and leapt up on the top of the table, his heart pounding harder than his feet as he took 1, 2, 3 steps across the granite and fell upon the hermit. Ara and Omrose were both knocked to the ground by their stools as the skeletons shook themselves back into their old shapes and followed Hallam over the table. Hermit, right?
Yeah.
The eunuch landed atop the old man and brought them both to the floor. Hallam punched in the hermit's long nose. Blood splashed hot against his cheeks. But to the eunuch's horror, the ancient man howled with laughter instead of pain. Putting his hands together, putting his hands to his hollow cheeks and hooting as the boy's fists fell again. Hallam's second punch made wet, slapping noises, and he felt the man's jaw shift in his face.
Oh.
But then bone fingers were tightening around both of the youth's wrists, and his neck, and his legs, and Hallam was yanked off the old man by the 3 skeletons, who held him aloft as the hermit shakily got to his feet, his face a giggling red smear. Our threw open the door and was confronted by another walking corpse, this one carrying a bundle over its shoulder. She darted past it into the night, but stumbled as she heard Omrose scream behind her. The girl had frozen in the doorway, and before Awa decided whether to run or to go back, another boneman came around the other side of the hut and seized her by the shoulders. "Hold them still and make them watch," the hermit commanded. And as Awa was dragged back inside, she saw that Omrose had her arms pinned behind her back by the new arrival, a shriveled husk of a corpse that had deposited its bundle on the table. The bundle moved, and as her skeletal captor hoisted her up, Awa saw that it was the bandit chief who had originally captured them. Jagged splinters of bone jutting out of his broken arms and legs. Only Hallam tried to avert his gaze, but the skeletons holding him got their fingers under his eyelids and made sure that he saw through his tears. The sensation of gritty bone pressing against their exposed eyeballs, arresting his struggles. The eunuch knew he would never escape if they blinded him. "Have a look, children," the hermit said, blood bubbling in the center of his swollen, mashed face as he drew a dagger from under his cloak. "Look close now." The blade cut into the bandit chief's face, and he began to scream. Omrose and Halim joined him, but Aua managed to keep her jaw set, even when the man's nose came off. The hermit popping the glistening lump into his mouth and chewing it with a serene expression on his desiccated face. The screams grew louder as the old man swallowed and wiped his bloody face on the front of his cloak. Looking back up at them, the hermit's caved-in nose was again straight and jutted out of his face like an accusatory finger. Then the old man began screaming again, with the broken bandit and Halim and Omrose dancing about around the hut, shrieking in their faces, rubbing imaginary tears from his cheeks and skipping like the happiest of spoiled children. When he noticed Aua was not screaming along with the rest, he paused for only a moment, giving her a saucy wink as he snatched up a clump of dried stalks studded with silver-trimmed green leaves from a basket by the hearth and ignited them on the fire. Puffing his cheeks and blowing out the flaming wormwood, the hermit inhaled the thick smoke billowing off the plants and howled even louder, prancing back towards them and shaking smoking clumps in their terror-taut faces. Omrose began to squirm and kick as her tormentor returned, but it was too late. And as the licorice-sweet fumes filled her nose, she calmed and then quieted. Her legs dangled and her eyes crossed. Her legs dangling and her eyes crossing. Halim had nearly screamed himself unconscious before the smoke even reached him, and so went almost at once. But Aua held her breath even when her eyes burned and her lungs boiled, and then she finally coughed and hacked and faded on the cloying smoke. The last thing she remembered, the old man putting his hand on the dying bandit's chief's shoulder whispered, "Pity Bobadil." I think we shall call it there.
Oh, that was so good.
Oh, brutal.